My name is Ryan Garcia. I'm 38 years old. I live just outside Denver, Colorado, in a quiet suburb where the houses all look responsibly financed and the lawns are trimmed within HOA guidelines. For most of my adult life, I've been described the same way: steady, reliable, a good man, the kind of man you don't have to worry about. I work in risk assessment for a mid-sized insurance firm. Numbers, probabilities, long-term consequences, that's my language. I've always believed that if you stay calm long enough, the truth eventually reveals itself. I built my life around that philosophy. A stable career, a marriage that looked solid from the outside. 3 children, I believed, were my greatest achievement. People tend to underestimate men like me. We don't shout. We don't dominate conversations. We don't storm out of rooms. I've been mistaken for passive more times than I can count. But there's a difference between being passive and being observant. And I have always been observant. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about rage. And it's not about destroying anyone. It's about something far quieter. It's about what happens when the foundation of your identity cracks, silently, beneath your feet. About a year ago, I secretly took DNA tests for my 3 children. I didn't do it out of paranoia. I didn't do it because I wanted to find something. I did it because something inside me had been unsettled for a long time, in a way I couldn't logically explain. When the results came back, I learnt none of them are biologically mine. The results revealed a betrayal so deep it shattered everything I believed about my family. But this story isn't only about the moment I opened those envelopes. It's about the years before that. How I was seen, what I ignored, the role I slowly accepted without realizing it. It's about how silence can be mistaken for weakness. And how sometimes the quietest man in the room is the only one paying attention. I didn't scream when I found out. I didn't confront anyone that night. I didn't even cry. I did what I've always done. I assessed. Over the next several months, I made decisions that would permanently alter the trajectory of everyone involved. No drama, no explosions, just clarity. If you've ever felt like the stable one, the dependable one, the person everyone assumes will simply endure, you might understand why this story unfolded the way it did. Tell me something before we continue. Have you ever discovered a truth so heavy that reacting emotionally would have been the weakest option? If you had asked my wife to describe me 5 years ago, she would have smiled politely and said, "Ryan's the stable one." That word followed me everywhere. Stable. At work, it meant Ice was the guy who double-checked projections before anyone else presented them. The one who stayed late without complaining. The one who didn't need praise because I wasn't emotional. My boss once told me, half joking, if everyone here were like you, we'd never have drama. At home, stable meant predictable, reliable. The man who paid the mortgage 2 weeks early. The father who never missed a school recital. The husband who didn't question receipts or late evenings because trust, in my mind, was something you demonstrated quietly, not demanded loudly. I wasn't flashy. I wasn't charismatic. I wasn't the loud dad at soccer games. I was the one holding the folding chair. When friends came over, I grilled. When something broke, I fixed it. When decisions needed to be made, I ran the numbers. I became the infrastructure of the household, necessary but rarely noticed. And here's the part I need to say clearly: I didn't resent it. There's dignity in being dependable. There's strength in being steady. I believed that. I still do. But over time, something subtle happened. People stopped asking what I thought. They started assuming what I would tolerate. Family vacations were planned around everyone else's preferences. Financial decisions were discussed after they had been emotionally made. If my wife disagreed with me in front of others, it was framed as me being overly cautious or too analytical. The room would laugh softly. I'd smile. I told myself it didn't matter. After all, I wasn't insecure. I didn't need to win arguments. I didn't need to dominate rooms. But there's a difference between choosing silence and being assigned it. At dinner tables, I noticed something else. My kids, who I adored without condition, would run to their mother first with stories. They sought her approval, her reactions, her energy. I was the steady background, the one who would always be there anyway. Predictable love is powerful, but it's also easy to overlook. I remember one evening vividly. We were at a neighborhood barbecue. My wife was laughing with another couple, telling a story about how I once fell asleep on the couch during a movie night. "He works too much," she said playfully. "Ryan lives in spreadsheets." Everyone chuckled. I smiled too. But what I heard wasn't humor. It was positioning. The dependable but slightly dull husband. The safe one. The man who wouldn't rock the boat. and maybe I had trained them to see me that way. I rarely contradict. I was rarely corrected. I believed that composure was strength. What I didn't realize was that invisibility can grow slowly, like mold behind a wall. Not dramatic, not obvious, but spreading. No one thought I would ever question the structure of my own life, because I never had before. They saw a man who would endure anything for stability, and for a long time, they were right. I didn't know then that the same qualities that made me safe in their eyes were quietly sharpening into something else, something watchful, something patient, something that would eventually refuse to be the background character in his own story. The first cut wasn't dramatic. There was no lipstick on a collar, no mysterious late-night phone calls whispered in another room, no cinematic moment where the music shifts and everything becomes obvious. It was smaller than that, which is why I almost ignored it. It happened on a Tuesday evening in early spring. I remember because I had just refinanced our mortgage, locked in a lower rate after weeks of research. I came home with a quiet sense of accomplishment, not pride exactly, just relief. Stability secured for another decade. The house was loud when I walked in. The kids were arguing over a tablet. My wife, Eleanor, was on the phone in the kitchen, her voice soft but sharp at the edges. She looked at me briefly, then turned her back slightly as she continued talking. That in itself wasn't unusual, but when she hung up, I asked casually, "Everything okay?" She hesitated, just half a second too long. "Yeah," she said, "just as stuff." Stuff. I nodded. I didn't press. Later that night, after the kids were asleep, I mentioned the refinance. I explained how much we'd save over the life of the loan. The numbers were solid, responsible, predictable. She listened, but not really. "That's good," she said, scrolling through her phone. "You're always good with that kind of thing." It wasn't dismissive in tone, but it was distancing in meaning. "You're good with that kind of thing," as if my role was financial insulation, as if my value existed in spreadsheets, not in shared decisions. Then she added, almost casually, "By the way, I might need to help my sister with some money. She's going through a rough patch."
Might not are too.
I asked how much. She shrugged. "We'll figure it out." We'll, except that the decision felt already made. That was the cut. Not betrayal, not yet. Just a subtle shift where consultation became notification. Over the next few weeks, similar moments stacked quietly. Small comments about how I wouldn't understand certain emotional dynamics. Jokes about how I'm too rational. Stories told about me in rooms where I was present but not fully included. Each moment alone was harmless. Together, they formed a pattern. And here's the part that matters. Everyone else seemed comfortable with it. Friends laughed. Her sister confided in her, not me. Even my kids started framing things as "Mum said," rather than "we decided." I wasn't excluded loudly. I was gently edited out. One night, I overheard Elena telling a friend, "Ryan's a good provider. He just doesn't really get the emotional side of things." That sentence stayed with me longer than it should have. Because I do understand emotions, I just don't perform them publicly. But once a narrative forms around you, it becomes easier for people to justify things you're not supposed to notice. That was the first time I felt something I couldn't quantify. Not jealousy, not suspicion, just displacement. Like I had been moved half a step to the side of my own life. I told myself I was overthinking. Stress, work pressure, normal marriage fluctuations. After all, stable men don't question small things. They absorb them. But somewhere in the back of my mind, a quiet voice had begun taking notes. And I've always trusted the part of me that takes notes. There's something dangerous about small cuts. You adapt to them. After that Tuesday night, nothing exploded. No confrontation, no confession. Life continued exactly as it always had. School drop-offs, weekend errands, family dinners, mortgage payments. Stability remained intact on the surface. But patterns, once noticed, become impossible to unsee. Elena began making more decisions independently, not recklessly, just unilaterally. She signed the kids up for extracurriculars without asking if my schedule could handle the transportation. She rearranged long-term savings allocations to free up liquidity for things she said were urgent, but never fully explained. When I'd ask questions, she'd sigh, not dramatically, but with subtle fatigue. "Ryan, it's not that complicated." That phrase became familiar. "It's not that complicated." Translated, it meant, "You're making this harder than it needs to be." At gatherings, I noticed something else. When stories about our marriage were told, I was cast in a consistent role. The overly cautious husband, the logical one, the man who needs convincing. I wasn't portrayed as malicious, just slightly behind the emotional curve. Once, during dinner with another couple, Eleanor laughed and said, "If I waited for Ryan to feel comfortable with every decision, we'd never do anything spontaneous." Everyone smiled. I did too. But what I heard wasn't humor, It was precedent. The implication was clear. Progress required bypassing me. And the unsettling part, I started cooperating with that narrative. If she wanted to make a quick decision, I'd nod. If she framed something as emotionally urgent, I'd step aside. Not because I agreed, but because challenging it felt exhausting. I rationalized it as maturity. Pick your battles. Keep the peace. Trust your partner. Those are the noble ideas. But peace built on unspoken discomfort has a quiet cost. The children mirrored the shift. When they wanted permission for something, they'd ask their mother first. Even if it involved money I managed or logistics I handled, if she said yes, my input became ceremonial. Dad, Mum already said it's fine. Fine. I wasn't being defied. I was being preempted. And slowly, I began editing myself. I stopped volunteering opinions unless asked directly. I avoided pushing back in social settings. I let jokes slide that subtly diminished my presence. It wasn't weakness. It was fatigue. There's a unique exhaustion that comes from defending your legitimacy in spaces where you're supposed to belong automatically. But here's the truth I didn't admit at the time. Part of me feared what pushing back might reveal. Because sometimes when you pull on a loose thread, you don't know how much of the structure will unravel. And I valued stability above almost everything, so I told myself a story. This is normal. This is marriage. This is a compromise. Except that compromise implies mutual adjustment. What I was practicing was accommodation. And accommodation, when it becomes habitual, quietly teaches people how much of you they can move without resistance. By the end of that year, something had shifted permanently. Not in our finances, not in our routines, but in the invisible hierarchy of our relationship. I was no longer a partner in certain conversations. I was the infrastructure beneath them, necessary, reliable, but not central. And still, I stayed calm, because I believed that if there was something real beneath the surface, it would eventually present itself. What I didn't know was that it already had, in the smallest ways possible. Roles don't get assigned in a single conversation. They settle over you gradually, like dust. One day, you look around and realize you're playing a part you never consciously agreed to. For me, it crystallized during a Sunday afternoon at my in-laws' house. We were sitting around their dining table, Eleanor's parents, her sister, and a couple of cousins. The kids were in the backyard. The conversation turned, as it often did, toward finances. Her sister was struggling again. Another short-term loan, another temporary setback. Eleanor spoke confidently about what we could do. Ryan's conservative, she said with a smile, but I can usually convince him. There was light laughter. Her father nodded at me approvingly. Good man, keeps things steady. Steady. And in that moment, I understood something with uncomfortable clarity. I wasn't the decision maker. I wasn't even the equal counterweight. I was the predictable obstacle that made Elena's choices look bold. The responsible one. The cautious one. The man whose resistance added drama, but never lasted long enough to matter. It wasn't malicious. That's what made it more complicated. No one was trying to humiliate me. No one raised their voice. But the framing was consistent. I was the safe structure she worked around. Reliable, useful, invisible. Later that evening, when we got home, I asked her gently, "Do you feel like you have to convince me of things?" She shrugged while unloading the dishwasher. "Sometimes. You overanalyze. Not everything needs a risk assessment." There it was again. My identity reduced to a caricature, and I let it sit there, because arguing would only confirm the narrative. Over the next few weeks, I began observing my own behavior more objectively, like a case study. When Elena proposed something spontaneous, a weekend trip, a financial favor, a schedule change, I would instinctively evaluate, ask questions, calculate implications. She would respond emotionally, emphasize urgency, frame hesitation as inflexibility. Eventually, I would concede, not because I was convinced, but because I valued harmony. And harmony, I realized, had become my assigned responsibility. If tension appeared, I diffused it. If there was uncertainty, I stabilized it. If there was financial strain, I absorbed it. I was the ballast of the ship, necessary weight below the surface. But ballast is rarely acknowledged. One night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and asked myself a question I hadn't allowed before. If I stopped stabilizing everything, what would happen? Not out of revenge, out of curiosity, because I began to sense something unsettling. The more predictable I became, the less anyone felt the need to consider me deeply. Predictability had turned into permission. Permission to assume. Permission to decide. Permission to speak for me. And the most uncomfortable realization, I had cooperated in building that version of myself. Not because I was weak, but because I believed strength meant endurance. I didn't yet know that endurance without boundaries eventually erodes identity. But something inside me had begun to shift. Quietly, I was still the stable one, but I was no longer unaware. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen during a dramatic discovery. It happened on an ordinary Thursday evening, in the most mundane way possible. I was cleaning the kitchen after dinner. Eleanor was upstairs helping our youngest with homework. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the dishwasher. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was a notification from our joint credit card account, one I monitor closely out of habit, not suspicion. A charge for a boutique hotel downtown, 2 nights. The amount wasn't astronomical, but it wasn't small either. I stood there staring at the notification longer than necessary. There are moments in life where your mind offers you 2 paths immediately. Path 1, rationalize. Path 2, observe. For years, I had chosen path 1, work conference, girls' weekend, surprise for someone. Innocent explanation pending, but something about the pattern of the past year, the unilateral decisions, the subtle repositioning, the emotional distancing, stopped me from jumping to conclusions or dismissals. Instead, I chose a third option. I said nothing. When Elena came downstairs later, she was relaxed. Normal. She asked if I'd finished the dishes. I nodded. She kissed my cheek casually. I watched her differently that night, not with suspicion, with clarity. The hotel charge wasn't what shifted me. It was my reaction to it. For the first time in our marriage, I felt no immediate need to protect the narrative of us, no instinct to preserve harmony, no rush to confront or accuse, just stillness. Later that night, while she slept beside me, I opened my laptop and reviewed the account history more thoroughly. There had been other charges over the past months, subtle ones. Restaurants in parts of town we didn't frequent together. Ride shares, at times, didn't align with what I remembered. Each one is individually explainable. Together, a pattern. And here's the truth. I still didn't feel rage. I felt recalibration, as if an internal compass I hadn't realized was drifting suddenly corrected itself. The next morning, I looked at my children differently too. Not with doubt. Not yet. Just with a quiet awareness that something in my life might not be structured the way I believed. That was the shift. Not suspicion of infidelity, but the realization that my version of reality might not be the only version operating inside my own home. At work that day, I didn't miss a beat. I ran meetings, reviewed projections, answered emails. But internally, something fundamental had changed. For years, I had been stabilizing a structure I assumed was mutually constructed. Now I wasn't sure. And when you're a man who builds his identity around precision, uncertainty is not something you ignore. That evening, Eleanor mentioned she'd be staying overnight with her sister to help her through some things. I nodded. I didn't question it, not because I believed it, but because I had decided on something far more significant. From that day forward, my silence would no longer be about keeping peace. It would be about gathering truth. There's a difference, and once you understand that difference, you can never go back to being uninformed. That Thursday didn't break my marriage. It broke my assumption, and assumptions, once shattered, don't quietly repair themselves. There's a version of silence that comes from fear, and there's another that comes from control. For most of my marriage, my silence had been diplomatic. I withheld reactions to preserve stability. I softened disagreements to prevent friction. I absorbed tension because I believed that was what strong men did. After that Thursday, my silence changed shape. It wasn't passive anymore. It was deliberate. Eleanor left that weekend to help her sister. I helped the kids pack small overnight bags because she said she might take them next time. I kept my voice steady. I asked normal questions. I made coffee the next morning and waved as she drove away. Then I sat at the kitchen table and opened my laptop, not to spy, to verify. When you work in risk assessment, you don't react to anomalies emotionally. You document them. You look for consistency. You track deviations. I began with financial patterns. I exported 6 months of transaction data, categorized expenses, flagged irregularities, compared timestamps with calendar entries. There were inconsistencies, not dramatic ones, but recurring enough to raise the probability above coincidence. Restaurants during work hours, ride shares to locations not near her office, that same boutique hotel, 3 times in 4 months. Still, I did not confront her, because confrontation without evidence is noise, and noise destroys leverage. When she returned Sunday evening, she was affectionate, almost overly so. She brought pastries from a bakery we liked. She asked about the kids in detail. She kissed me longer than usual in the kitchen. If I hadn't been watching, I might have interpreted it as a reconnection. But observation changes perception. Over the next few weeks, I adjusted my behavior subtly. I became even calmer, even more agreeable. I stopped asking clarifying questions entirely, and that unsettled her more than any argument would have. Quiet lately, she'd ye. Nice night. I've always been quiet, I replied evenly. She studied my face. Searching for something, I gave her nothing. Silence, when it's no longer seeking approval, becomes unnerving to people who benefited from it. Meanwhile, I scheduled something else quietly. DNA testing kits. Not because I had proof of anything involving the children, but because once doubt enters a system, you audit the entire system. That decision wasn't fueled by anger. It was fueled by logic. If infidelity were statistically probable, paternity certainty dropped proportionally. It was cold math. I collected samples discreetly. Hair from brushes. Used toothbrush heads. I told myself I was overcorrecting. That the results would come back confirming my fears was exaggerated. Part of me hoped for that outcome. Because if the children were unquestionably mine, at least one pillar of my life would remain intact. While waiting for the results, I continued observing. Eleanor grew slightly more cautious with her phone, more protective, more alert when I entered rooms unexpectedly. These are not accusations. They are behaviors, and behavior, over time, reveals truth more reliably than confession. The most important change wasn't external, it was internal. I stopped identifying as the stabilizer of our marriage. I began identifying as an independent actor inside it. That shift is subtle but powerful, because once you stop seeing yourself as responsible for preserving something at all costs, you begin evaluating whether it deserves preservation. I was very clear, receiving information that would make that evaluation permanent. People assume preparation looks dramatic. It doesn't. Preparation looks like routine. That was the advantage of who I had always been. No one questions the quiet man reviewing documents late at night. No one finds it suspicious when the risk analyst runs numbers. They had grown comfortable with my habits, which meant they never noticed when those habits became something else. While waiting for the DNA results, I began auditing my entire life. Not emotionally, but structurally. First, finances. I scheduled a consultation with a family law attorney under the pretense of estate planning review. It wasn't deception, it was prudence. I needed to understand my position without triggering anything prematurely. I asked questions hypothetically. If someone discovered non-paternity years into a marriage, what would that mean legally? The attorney's face didn't change. She'd heard variations of the scenario before. Her answers were precise. In Colorado, timing matters. Documentation matters. Voluntary assumption of paternity matters. The longer you act as the legal father, the stronger that presumption becomes. I listened carefully. Took notes. No drama, just data. Next, assets. I separated certain investment accounts under permissible guidelines. Shifted liquidity into vehicles protected by statute. Not illegally. Strategically. Everything documented, everything clean. At home, nothing changed externally. I still helped with homework, still made breakfast, still attended school events, but I began noticing details I had previously filtered out. My middle child's blood type. It didn't match mine or Elena's. I had once dismissed it as a genetic anomaly. Now I researched it thoroughly. It was statistically unlikely without outside contribution. My oldest son's resemblance to a man I had met once at a fundraiser, a man Elena had described as just a colleague. I replayed that memory slowly, analytically. Memory is unreliable. Patterns are not. The most unsettling realization wasn't about infidelity. It was about timeline overlap. If the hotel charges aligned with certain dates, if pregnancies aligned with certain travel periods, if emotional distance preceded financial independence, the pieces began forming a model I could no longer ignore. And still I remained composed. At work, I performed better than ever. There's a clarity that comes when emotional noise is replaced by focus. My colleagues noticed my calm. One even said, "You've been sharp lately." I nodded. Sharp is what happens when denial dissolves. Meanwhile, Eleanor sensed something but couldn't articulate it. She initiated more physical closeness, more check-ins. You okay, You okay?" she asked. One night. "I'm fine," I said truthfully, because I was. I wasn't spiraling. I wasn't angry. I was preparing. The DNA results were scheduled to arrive on a Wednesday. I took that day off work without explanation. Told my team I needed personal time. That morning, I cleaned the house meticulously. Not out of anxiety, out of control. There's something grounding about restoring order to your environment before receiving information that may destabilize it. When the envelope notification appeared in my email portal, I didn't open it immediately. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, placed my grandfather's watch in front of me. Time measured, because once opened, There would be no returning to uncertainty. And here's what no one ever noticed about me. I don't act until I'm ready to live with the outcome. By that Wednesday afternoon, I was ready. Not for vindication, not for rage, for clarity. The house was silent when I logged in, and I understood with absolute certainty that whatever those results said, my life was about to be divided into before and after. There's a particular kind of silence that exists just before truth enters a room. It isn't loud. It doesn't shake walls. It simply waits. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open. The house was empty. Elena had taken the kids to school. Sunlight came through the blinds in thin, precise lines across the floor. My grandfather's watch ticked softly beside me. Measured time. I logged into the testing portal. The notification banner was simple. Results available. No warning. No emotional framing. Just data waiting to be interpreted. I clicked. The first file opened. My oldest son. Probability of paternity, 0%. There are moments when your brain rejects information on reflex. I stared at the number longer than necessary, almost expecting it to adjust, to refresh, to correct itself. It didn't. I moved to the second file. Probability of paternity, 0%. Still no emotional collapse, just a tightening in my chest. Controlled, contained. The third file loaded more slowly, or maybe it only felt that way. Probability of paternity, 0%. All three. I leaned back in my chair slowly, not in shock, in recalculation. The results revealed a betrayal so deep it shattered everything I believed about my family. Not just infidelity, systematic deception. 3 pregnancies, 3 births, years of bedtime stories, doctor appointments, parent-teacher conferences, first steps, fevers, Christmas mornings, and biologically, none of them mine. I didn't cry. That's not a strength. It's just how I process. Emotion arrives later for me, after analysis. My mind moved through layers quickly. Timeline, legal standing, financial exposure, emotional impact on the children. Because here's the complexity. The children are innocent, completely. My love for them didn't evaporate in that moment. It is simply separated from biology. And that separation is harder to describe than anger would be. I closed the laptop and sat still for several minutes. Not collapsing, not pacing, breathing. There is something uniquely destabilizing about discovering that your entire paternal identity was built on false premises. It's not just about genetics. It's about agency. Choice was removed from me. I was never given the option to decide whether I would raise another man's children. That decision was made on my behalf, repeatedly. And that is where the fracture occurred. Not in love. In consent. I reopened the laptop and downloaded copies of everything. Stored them securely. Printed hard copies. Documented timestamps. Preparation replaces panic. By the time Elena's car pulled into the driveway that afternoon, I had already transitioned from discovery to strategy. She walked in cheerfully, asking about my day off. It was productive, I said calmly, which was true. I watched her differently now, not as my wife of 13 years, but as a variable in a system that required reassessment. I studied micro-expressions, tone shifts, phone placement, proximity. Did she know that I knew? No, because I gave her nothing to detect. That night, as we sat at dinner, my oldest son asked me for help with a math problem. I explained it patiently, the same way I always had. And in that moment, something solidified inside me. My response would not be impulsive. It would be deliberate. Not because I lacked pain, but because I refused to let pain dictate permanent decisions. The betrayal was confirmed. Now came the harder question. What do you do when the truth destroys the structure of your life? But the people inside that structure are still children who call you dad. I already knew there were multiple paths forward. Only one of them would be irreversible, and I was very close to choosing it. There are moments in life when emotion demands action. This was not one of them. After the results, I gave myself 72 hours before making any irreversible move. Not because I doubted the data, but because clarity improves when given space. During those 3 days, I outlined my options with the same precision I use for risk projections at work. Option 1. Confront Elena immediately. Demand explanation. Demand truth. Demand names. That path would satisfy emotion. It would produce answers quickly. It would also eliminate strategic advantage. Option 2. Say nothing. Continue the marriage. Raise the children as if nothing had changed. Absorb the knowledge privately. That path would preserve surface stability. It would also require permanent self-betrayal. Option 3. Quietly initiate legal separation while documenting everything. Protect assets, secure evidence, prepare for controlled disclosure. That path would be slow, cold, deliberate, irreversible. I didn't sleep much during those nights. Not from anxiety, but from mental calculation. The central variable wasn't Elena, it was the children. Because regardless of biology, I had been their father for over a decade. I was in every memory they consciously held. The one who taught them to ride bikes. The one who stayed up during flu season. The one who checked homework and drove to practice. Love doesn't vanish because DNA does, but trust does.
Antimalterji coming porushwianet.
Marriage without trust is structural fiction. On the second night, I stood in the hallway outside their bedrooms after they had fallen asleep. I listened to the quiet rhythm of their breathing. This was the hardest truth to accept. My relationship with them would have to be redefined. Not abandoned, not weaponized, but redefined. I refused to punish children for adult deception, but I also refused to continue living inside a lie. By the third morning, the emotional fog had cleared. I chose option 3, not because it was cruel, because it was controlled. That afternoon, I retained the attorney I had consulted earlier. This time, not hypothetically. I provided documentation. DNA results, financial records, timeline discrepancies. She was composed, efficient. Given the circumstances, she said, we move carefully. You do not disclose until we're positioned. Positioned. That word resonated. For years, I had been positioned as the stable one, the predictable one, the man who would endure. Now I was positioning myself. We began filing preliminary separation paperwork quietly. Not publicly served yet, just prepared. Asset protection measures tightened, accounts restructured within legal bounds. Meanwhile, at home, nothing appeared different. I attended a school recital that week, smiled in family photos, sat beside Elena at dinner with friends. And here's the unsettling part. She seemed comfortable, because she still believed I was the same man who would prioritize harmony over truth. She had no reason to suspect otherwise, until the paperwork made it impossible to ignore. This decision wasn't explosive. It was surgical, and once initiated, it could not be undone. I had crossed the line internally. The next phase would unfold in silence. Once you decide, hesitation becomes liability. I didn't rush, but I didn't drift either. The attorney drafted the separation documents with precision. Grounds cited irreconcilable differences, no accusations yet. The DNA results were documented but not weaponized. Timing would matter. Tone would matter. I opened an individual bank account at a different institution. Transparent. Legal. My direct deposit was redirected under the guidance of counsel. Joint accounts remained funded enough to avoid suspicion, but not exposed enough to leave me vulnerable. I updated beneficiary designations where permitted, adjusted investment structures, secured digital copies of tax returns, property deeds, and insurance policies. None of it is dramatic. All of it is necessary. At home, I remained steady. If anything, calmer than usual. I listened more, spoke less. Eleanor interpreted it as emotional reconnection. One night, she said, almost softly, "You feel different lately. In a good way." "I've been thinking," I replied, which was the most honest thing I'd said in weeks. She didn't press further, because people rarely question stability when it benefits them. I scheduled a private meeting with a child psychologist recommended by my attorney, not for therapy, but for consultation. I needed to understand potential impact scenarios before disclosure. How you frame this, the psychologist told me, will shape their identity for years. That sentence carried more weight than any legal advice. This wasn't about proving betrayal. It was about protecting the psychological stability of 3 children who had no agency in any of this. Meanwhile, Elena's behavior fluctuated subtly. Increased phone privacy, occasional unexplained absences framed as errands, heightened attentiveness when I seemed distant. Guilt has patterns, but I didn't confront. Confrontation is reactive. Positioning is proactive. The formal filing date was set for a Tuesday morning. Service would occur while I was at work and the children were at school. I refused to create a scene in front of them. The night before filing, we had dinner together like any other evening. The kids argued about homework. Eleanor laughed at something on her phone. I watched the ordinary rhythm of a life that structurally was already over. There's a strange calm that arrives when the worst truth has already been absorbed internally. Nothing external can destabilize you further. I wasn't angry. I wasn't vengeful. I was resolved. That mechanical watch on my wrist felt heavier than usual. Each second marked the distance from the man I had been, the man who endured without questioning. By the time I went to bed that night, everything was in motion. Not publicly, not emotionally, but legally, strategically, permanently. And the next day, consequences would begin, quietly at first. Because when a foundation shifts beneath someone who never saw it coming, the confusion is immediate. But the realization, that takes longer. Elena was served at exactly 11:40 a.m. on a Tuesday. I know the time because precision matters to me. My attorney sent a short confirmation message. She's been notified. No elaboration, No emotional framing, just confirmation that something invisible had become real. I was in a glass conference room at work when the text arrived. 4 colleagues were seated across from me. A quarterly risk model was projected on the screen behind my shoulder. I read the message once, locked my phone, and continued speaking about long-term exposure adjustments as if nothing had shifted. Because externally, nothing had. Preparation creates a strange kind of calm. When you've already processed the worst internally, the external trigger doesn't destabilize you. It simply initiates a sequence. My phone buzzed again 10 minutes later, then again. I didn't look at it until the meeting ended. 5 missed calls, 7 text messages. The first read, "Ryan, what is this?" The second, "Is this real?" The third, "Call me right now." There were more after that. The tone shifted from confusion to urgency, then to something sharper. I responded once, "We'll talk tonight, not over text." Measured, neutral. Control isn't about domination, it's about timing. The rest of the workday unfolded normally. Emails, calls, performance reviews. If anyone sensed a shift in me, they didn't say so. But internally, something had aligned. For years, I had been reacting within a system I didn't fully understand. Now I was operating from clarity. When I pulled into the driveway that evening, Eleanor's car was already there. The kitchen lights were on. The house looked exactly the same as it had the night before. But sameness can be deceptive. She was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in. The separation documents were spread out in front of her like evidence in a courtroom drama, except this wasn't dramatic. It was administrative. Her face wasn't angry, it was disoriented. "What is this?" she asked. Her voice carried a tremor she was trying to suppress. "A separation filing," I said calmly, setting my briefcase down. "For what reason?" There are moments when a person realizes they are no longer in control of the narrative. I watched that realization begin forming behind her eyes. "We'll discuss details privately," I replied. "The kids are home." That sentence shifted the atmosphere more than anything else, because it implied 2 things. First, that there were details. Second, I would choose when and how they were revealed. The children were in the living room arguing about a video game. Ordinary noise, familiar chaos. I walked in and asked about their day the way I always did. Helped with homework, set the table. Routine is powerful. It stabilizes the innocent while destabilizing the guilty. Eleanor followed me into the kitchen later, her voice lowered. "Why would you do this without even talking to me?" I looked at her evenly. "I've been talking," I said. "You just haven't been listening." That wasn't an accusation, it was an observation. Over the next hour, her responses cycled predictably. Confusion, emotional appeal, defensive logic. "If this is about money, we can fix it. If I've been distant, I'm sorry. Is there someone else?" Notice what wasn't said. Not once did she ask, "What do you know?" Because she didn't yet understand that knowledge, not suspicion, was driving this. I didn't mention the DNA results, not that night. You don't detonate the core truth before the environment is structurally ready for it. That evening I slept in the guest room, not out of anger, out of bounds. And that was the first visible shift in the house. The next morning the children noticed. "Dad, why are you in here?" my youngest asked innocently. "Just needed space to think," I said gently. Children accept simple explanations when delivered calmly. Elena, on the other hand, did not accept calm easily. Calm unsettles someone expecting volatility. Over the following days, consequences began to ripple outward. She contacted a lawyer. I could tell from the sudden tension in her posture when she stepped outside to take calls. She began reviewing financial accounts. Not because she had been excluded, everything was legally accessible, but because she sensed movement she hadn't authorized. "Why are some transfers different?" she asked one afternoon. I replied. That lack of elaboration frustrated her more than anger would have. Anger gives someone something to fight. Composure gives them nothing to hold on to. Friends started reaching out cautiously. Word spreads quickly in suburban social circles when legal paperwork is filed. Invitations slowed. Texts shifted tone. "Are you guys okay?" Heard something was going on. I declined to explain. "This is private," I would say. Meanwhile, Eleanor oscillated emotionally. Some nights she was conciliatory, soft, almost nostalgic. 13 years, Ryan," she whispered once. "We can't just throw that away." Throw away, as if I had casually discarded something trivial. Other nights her tone sharpened. "If this is about control, you don't get to just blindside me." Control. It was interesting hearing that word from her, because for years, control had existed subtly, through narrative framing, emotional positioning, and unilateral decisions. Now the axis had shifted. The children sensed tension but didn't understand its architecture. I maintained their routines meticulously. School lunches are packed on time. Weekend soccer attendance is uninterrupted. Bedtime conversations are unchanged. If there was going to be a fracture, it would not begin with them. Inside the house, however, something had permanently altered. There's a psychological phenomenon when someone who has been underestimated reveals their capacity. The response is rarely immediate accountability. It's confusion. How did this happen? She asked repeatedly, as if the filing had materialized spontaneously, as if years of subtle displacement had not preceded it. On the fourth evening after service, she finally asked the question that mattered. What do you think I've done? There it was. Not denial, not confession. Inquiry. I held her gaze calmly. I think you've taken away my right to choose, I said quietly. She blinked, processing. That statement didn't reference infidelity explicitly. It referenced the agency.
And you.
And agency is harder to argue against. Consequences had begun, but they were still surface level. Legal paperwork, financial restructuring, social tension, the deeper consequence. The truth that would redefine everything remained unspoken. But tension builds toward revelation. It doesn't dissipate on its own. Elena was beginning to understand that this wasn't about a temporary marital strain. This was structural. And when structural integrity is questioned, panic follows. The house felt quieter each night, smaller. She moved through rooms as if trying to locate where the shift had originated. But the shift had not happened in a room. It had happened to me. And once a man who has endured without question begins operating from certainty, the consequences are no longer negotiable. The confusion was only the beginning, because the next phase would remove any ambiguity left. And ambiguity, for someone who has lived inside an assumption, is the last shield before collapse. Panic doesn't arrive all at once. It leaks in. After a week of living inside uncertainty, Eleanor's composure began to fracture in small, visible ways. Her phone calls grew longer. Her tone was sharper. She moved through the house with restless energy, opening drawers she had no reason to open, reviewing documents she had already read. She was searching for something, not evidence. Leverage. One evening, after the kids were asleep, she stood in the doorway of the guest room where I had been sleeping. She didn't knock. She just stood there. "You're not telling me something," she said quietly. "That's true," I replied. Silence stretched between us. "If there's something you think I've done, just say it." There's a temptation in moments like that, to release everything, to lay out proof, to force confession. But timing is not about emotion, it's about impact. "I will," I said calmly. But not tonight. That answer unsettled her more than the accusation would have, because she realized something irreversible. I was no longer reacting to her behavior. I was operating from knowledge she didn't yet understand. Over the next few days, the tone shifted from confusion to repair attempts. She cooked more, initiated conversations about vacations we had once discussed, brought up early memories from when we first met. "Remember our first apartment," she said one afternoon, smiling faintly. "We were so broke, but we were solid." Solid. The word echoed differently now. I listened politely. But nostalgia cannot rebuild trust that was never honestly constructed. Then came the first crack in her certainty. She asked directly, "Did someone tell you something?" "No," I answered. "Did you go through my phone?" "No." Truth was pressing against the surface. She could feel it. "It's based on reality," I said evenly. Her jaw tightened. "What does that even mean?"
It means I need you cooking a
That was the moment fear entered the room fully. Not theatrical fear, existential fear. Because when someone realizes you're acting from confirmed information, not suspicion, they begin retracing every decision they've made. Every lie, every inconsistency. She became quieter after that, watchful. Panic changes posture. I saw it in the way she held her shoulders, slightly elevated, as if bracing. In the way she lingered near my office door when I was on calls. In the way she studied my face for cracks in composure. But there were none. The children remained unaware of specifics, though they sensed emotional temperature. My oldest asked one night, "Are you and Mum fighting?" "No," I said gently. "We're figuring some things out." That was true. Eleanor tried once more, this time with vulnerability rather than control. "I don't want to lose our family," she said quietly. "Whatever this is, we can fix it." Fix. That word again. "You can't fix something that was never built, honestly," I replied. She stared at me as if I had spoken a foreign language, because from her perspective, the structure had been functioning. It had held. It had produced years of outward stability. But stability built on withheld truth is an illusion, and illusions collapse the moment light touches them. She began sleeping poorly. I could hear her pacing at night. It was too late for repair, not because I was unwilling to talk, but because the foundation had already been audited, and the results were definitive. The confrontation was coming, not explosive, not chaotic, but clarifying. And once clarity is spoken aloud, there is no negotiation left. The confrontation happened on a Sunday afternoon, not at night, not during an argument. In daylight, the children were at a friend's house for a birthday party. I had arranged it intentionally, normalcy for them, space for us. Eleanor was in the kitchen when I walked in, holding a manila folder. Not dramatically, not like evidence in a courtroom, just documentation. "We should talk," I said evenly. She froze slightly. Not visibly to anyone else, but I noticed. We sat across from each other at the dining table, where we had celebrated birthdays, signed school forms, and planned vacations. The setting was familiar, the context was not. "I need you to listen without interrupting," I said calmly. Her lips parted slightly. But she's nodded. I placed 3 printed documents on the table and slid them forward. DNA results. She looked down. At first, confusion. Then recognition. Then something deeper, calculation collapsing in real time. She didn't touch the papers immediately. "This isn't possible," she said quietly. "It is," I replied. Silence, the kind that hums at your ears. She picked up the first sheet, scanning it quickly. Then the second. Then the third. Her breathing shifted. "You tested them?" "Yes." "When?" "A few weeks ago." Her eyes lifted slowly to meet mine. "You didn't even ask me." There it was, the reflex to question my process, not her actions. "I wasn't asking for permission to confirm reality," I said evenly. Tears formed in her eyes, but I saw something else beneath them, not just guilt. Exposure. "This doesn't mean what you think it means," she said quickly.
Then tell me what it means.
She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Time stretched. Finally, quietly. "It was complicated. Complicated. 3 pregnancies, 13 years, thousands of decisions. Complicated." "Were any of them conceived while we were separated?" I asked. "No." "Did I ever know?" She shook her head. "Did you intend to tell me?" Silence. That was the answer. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lean forward. "I was never given the choice," I said. "You decided for me," repeatedly. She began crying openly then, not loud, not dramatic, just breaking. "I was scared," she whispered. "Of what?" "Of losing you." The irony hung between us. "You lost me when you removed my agency," I replied. She tried one last appeal. "They're still your children." I nodded slowly. "They're children I love. That doesn't change. But biology isn't the core issue. What is? Consent." That word landed harder than an accusation, because it reframed everything. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about autonomy. For years, I'd been positioned as stable, predictable, enduring. But endurance without truth is not strength. It's erasure. "I won't expose you publicly," I said calmly. "This stays contained for the children's sake. But the marriage is over." She looked at me like she was searching for the man who would reconsider. He wasn't there anymore. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, just clarity. And clarity, when delivered without heat, leaves no room for argument. The illusion had ended. What remained was the consequence. It's been 11 months since that Sunday afternoon. The house is different now. Smaller, quieter. There are fewer framed photos on the walls. Not because I removed memories, but because I redefined them. Elena and I finalized the divorce 6 months ago. It was controlled, private. No public scandal. No character assassination. The truth exists on paper, not in gossip. The children still call me Dad. That part surprises people when they hear the story later. They assume biology dictates attachment. It doesn't. Presence does. But the relationship is different now. Not colder, not distant, just honest. When they are old enough, they will know the full truth. Not framed as betrayal, not framed as shame. Just reality. Their origin story includes complexity. That complexity is not their fault. As for me,
I am the law. One by default.
I am stable by choice. There's a difference. For years, my identity was constructed around endurance. The man who absorbs tension. The man who keeps everything functioning. The ballast is beneath the surface. Now I understand something I didn't before. Strength without boundaries invites erasure. I still wake up early, still wear my grandfather's watch, still analyze risk for a living, but I don't tolerate displacement anymore. If someone minimizes my voice, I address it immediately, calmly, directly, not aggressively, just clearly. There's a quiet confidence that comes from surviving the collapse of your own narrative. When you've lost the version of life you believed was permanent, smaller disruptions don't intimidate you. Friends have asked if I'm angry. I'm not. Anger is heavy. It requires maintenance. Clarity is lighter. I don't hate Eleanor. I don't even wish her harm. She made decisions rooted in fear and control. Those decisions carried consequences. That's not vengeance, that's structure. The hardest part wasn't discovering the DNA results. It was realizing how easily I had allowed myself to be positioned in a role that erased my agency. That responsibility is mine. I chose silence for too long. I chose harmony over verification. I chose endurance over inquiry. I won't make that mistake again. The children see something different in me now, not colder, just firmer. They ask my opinion more. They notice when I speak. Presence has weight when it isn't automatically available at any cost. If there's one shift that defines who I am now, it's this. I don't react. I respond. And I don't preserve structures that require self-betrayal to maintain. The man who endured quietly still exists, but now he operates with boundaries. And boundaries are not loud. They're decisive. When I look back on everything, the DNA results weren't the most painful part. The betrayal wasn't even the deepest wound. It was the realization that I had slowly disappeared inside my own life. Quietly, politely, responsibly. And I mistook that disappearance for strength. Here's what I understand now. Loyalty without verification isn't virtue. Silence without boundaries isn't maturity. Endurance without agency isn't love. For years, I believed that being the stable one meant absorbing discomfort to keep everything intact. I thought composure meant tolerating subtle displacement. But real composure isn't about enduring deception. It's about facing the truth without losing yourself. I didn't explode. I didn't humiliate. I didn't destroy. I documented. I prepared. I chose. And that choice changed everything. The children are still part of my life. They always will be. My love for them was never transactional, but my identity as a man, as a husband, as a father, that had to be rebuilt on honesty, not assumption. If there's a lesson here, it's not never trust. It's this: trust, but remain awake. Pay attention to patterns. Pay attention to how you're positioned. Pay attention to whether your silence is chosen or assigned. Because once you allow yourself to be quietly erased, reclaiming your presence requires something stronger than anger. It requires clarity, and clarity is not loud. It's decisive. So let me ask you something. If you discovered that the foundation of your life had been built without your consent, would you react emotionally, or would you move in silence until the truth could no longer be denied? I'd genuinely like to hear how you would handle it.